Johnny Depp boarded the plane as if it were just another day. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. As he walked down the aisle, he noticed something that made him stop immediately. An elderly woman, sitting alone, was being treated with disdain by a staff member. Her expression, filled with sadness and discomfort, did not go unnoticed by Johnny. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. What did he do next? Something no one could have imagined. In a swift move, he stepped forward and, without hesitation, did something that turned the situation upside down. What happened after this intervention? Get ready, because the twist will surprise you. Have you ever witnessed someone being disrespected? What would you do if you had the chance to change it, just like Johnny Depp did? If you believe respect should be defended at all costs, subscribe now and like this video. Let's spread stories that show the power of a simple act of empathy together. Johnny Depp boarded the plane with the ease of someone used to being recognized. But in that moment, he wasn't the Hollywood star. He was just an ordinary man, boarding a routine flight like any other passenger. However, as he walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, something caught his attention. Something that made him stop in his tracks, as if fate had set up that moment for him. There, at the back of the plane, an elderly woman with graying hair was being treated disrespectfully by one of the airline staff. Her face, marked by time, seemed too weak to react to the humiliation she was suffering. The staff member, brusquely, scolded her for what seemed like a simple misunderstanding. The elderly woman tried to explain, but her words were ignored, and her discomfort was palpable. The situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, and no one around seemed willing to intervene. Johnny, who was about to sit in his seat, saw it all. He stopped watching the scene with a fixed gaze. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed injustices, but something about that woman deeply moved him. He approached, feeling the weight of the situation. The elderly woman, with her trembling hands, tried to adjust herself in the seat while the staff member, growing more impatient, insisted that she follow the flight rules. What seemed like a simple disagreement was turning into something much bigger. Johnny knew he couldn't just ignore it. Something inside him told him that this was the moment to make a difference, to intervene, to change the course of that situation. He looked around, and other passengers seemed uncomfortable, but no one dared to speak up. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was then that Johnny made a decision. He couldn't let this pass. Johnny took a deep breath and walked towards the scene. The elderly woman's face, a mixture of confusion and embarrassment, was enough to fuel his anger. He had seen a lot in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just a customer service issue. It was about respect, and Johnny wasn't one to let that slide. As he approached, the flight attendant noticed him, but his focus remained on the woman. He placed a hand gently on the seat next to her and spoke with a calm but firm voice. "Excuse me, I believe there's been some sort of misunderstanding here." The attendant, who had been snapping at the woman, turned sharply, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Sir, this is none of your business," he replied, his tone cold and dismissive. But Johnny wasn't one to back down. He looked the attendant square in the eye, his voice steady, but with an edge that commanded attention. "I think you'll find it is my business. Treating people with respect is everyone's business." The flight attendant's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but Johnny raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't think you understand the situation," Johnny continued, his gaze never leaving the attendants. "This woman deserves the same courtesy you would show any other passenger. She doesn't need to be treated like this." The tension in the cabin grew thick. Passengers were starting to look up, sensing that something was about to happen. Some tried to avoid eye contact. Others leaned in, eager to see how this would play out. But Johnny stood his ground, unwavering. The attendant, now visibly flustered, took a step back. I don't have time for this," he muttered, his voice faltering. "You're causing a scene?" Johnny's eyes narrowed. "A scene? No. What you're doing is causing a scene. But I'll tell you what, I'll handle it from here." Johnny didn't wait for the attendant's next move. He gently placed a hand on the elderly woman's shoulder, offering a reassuring smile. "Ma'am, don't worry. Everything's going to be all right." The woman, clearly overwhelmed, looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also confusion. I don't want to cause trouble, she whispered, her voice trembling. Johnny shook his head, his eyes softening. You're not causing trouble. You're just standing up for yourself, and that's something we all deserve. The attendant, still standing nearby, looked furious. You need to leave this area, sir. Now, he snapped, his voice sharp. Johnny didn't flinch. I'm not going anywhere, Johnny replied calmly. But you? You should reconsider how you treat people, especially those who don't have a voice in situations like this. The entire cabin had gone silent now. Passengers were holding their breath, watching as the confrontation unfolded. Johnny stood tall, his posture confident, his presence commanding. It was clear that he wasn't backing down. The attendant hesitated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Johnny knew that this wasn't just about the elderly woman anymore. It was about dignity, about doing what was right. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure the situation was rectified. The attendant looked around the cabin, realizing that he was losing control of the situation. He could feel the eyes of every passenger on him. Johnny had turned the tables, and now, the flight attendant was the one who felt like he was on trial. Johnny took a step closer to the attendant, his voice low but firm. You know, sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference. A simple act of kindness can change someone's day, and sometimes, even their life. But the opposite is true too. A harsh word, a rude gesture, can leave scars. Do you want to be remembered for that? The attendant didn't respond. He was speechless, his anger replaced by a dawning realization that he had crossed a line. The woman, still sitting in her seat, now looked at Johnny with a mixture of awe and relief. For the first time, she seemed to breathe easier. The tension in the air had lifted, and it was clear that Johnny had just defused a potentially explosive situation. Just as the attendant was about to respond, something unexpected happened. The sound of a door opening echoed from the front of the plane. Johnny didn't immediately turn, but the passengers did. All eyes were on the new arrival, and the atmosphere shifted in an instant. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, with an air of quiet confidence. It was unmistakable. Johnny Depp. The room fell into a stunned silence. It wasn't just the appearance of a famous celebrity that caused the stir. It was the timing. Johnny Depp had just entered the scene at the exact moment when the tension had reached its peak. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Johnny, the actor, the icon, the man who had captivated audiences around the world, now stood in the middle of an almost surreal situation. And he wasn't just any passenger. He was Johnny Depp, a man who had been a part of so many stories of his own. Yet, now, he was about to become part of someone else's. He glanced around the cabin, quickly assessing the situation. His gaze fell on the elderly woman, who was still sitting in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then his eyes shifted to the flight attendant, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. For a moment, everything was still. It was as if time had paused, and all the passengers were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Johnny Depp, the man who had once played pirates and outlaws, was now in the middle of an entirely different kind of drama. Johnny Depp's eyes locked with the flight attendants, and the tension in the air thickened. There was no denying it. Johnny Depp had just become the unexpected hero in this story. But what would he do next? Without missing a beat, Johnny took a few steps toward the attendant. His voice, calm but commanding, broke the silence. Is there a problem here? The flight attendant, still standing stiffly, blinked a few times before he found his voice. No, sir. Everything is fine, he stammered. Johnny didn't buy it. He could see the unease in the attendant's posture, the way his eyes darted around the cabin. The man was clearly rattled, and Johnny knew exactly why. I don't think everything is fine, Johnny said, his voice still steady, but now tinged with an underlying firmness. I've been watching, and I think this lady deserves an apology. Don't you agree? The attendant, now visibly sweating, looked around the cabin. He saw the eyes of the passengers, all of them waiting, watching. There was no escaping it now. The situation had spiraled far beyond what he had expected. Johnny Depp had just turned the tables. The attendant stood there, caught in the spotlight, his mind racing for a way out. But Johnny Depp wasn't giving him an out. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by unnoticed. The elderly woman, still seated, glanced nervously at the man, unsure of what would happen next. Johnny turned back to her, his voice softening. "You don't need to be afraid anymore. You're safe now." The woman gave a small nod, her eyes welling up with tears. She had been humiliated, treated as if she didn't matter. But now, there was a sense of dignity in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that made her feel seen, heard, and respected. Johnny, sensing her discomfort, placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. Then he turned back to the flight attendant. "You know, it's not just about this moment. It's about how we treat each other every day. A small act of kindness can go a long way, don't you think?" The attendant, who had been bracing for confrontation, was now faced with a moment of truth. He could feel the weight of Johnny's words and the eyes of the passengers on him. He had been rude, disrespectful, and dismissive. And now, he was being called out for it. I'm sorry," the attendant said, his voice quiet, almost inaudible. He looked at the elderly woman who had been the target of his harsh treatment. "I didn't mean to upset you. I was just frustrated." Johnny nodded, his expression softening. "We all get frustrated, but that's no excuse to treat someone poorly. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are." The flight attendant, now visibly shaken, nodded slowly. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him long after this moment. But the transformation wasn't just for him. It was for everyone in that cabin, for every person who had witnessed this exchange. Johnny turned back to the elderly woman. "I think you deserve a better seat. How about we move you to a more comfortable spot?" She looked at him, her face breaking into a smile. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Johnny smiled back, his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. He had done more than just stand up for someone in that moment. He had sparked a change, a shift in how people saw one another. It wasn't just about one person standing up for another, it was about all of them standing up for what was right. The passengers, who had been silent observers up until now, began to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged glances, while others nodded in agreement. It was clear that Johnny Depp had made an impact. His words, his actions, had transformed the atmosphere of the entire flight. Johnny's simple act of standing up for what was right had ignited a wave of change. The attendant, though embarrassed, would never forget this moment. The elderly woman, who had been humiliated, now felt a sense of dignity and respect that had been missing for so long. And the passengers, who had witnessed it all, would carry the lesson with them. Johnny had shown them all that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about humanity. It was about treating each other with kindness, respect, and dignity. As Johnny Depp's words settled into the minds of the passengers, something remarkable began to happen. The tension that had hung in the air like a thick fog began to dissipate. What had once been a room filled with discomfort and unease was now transforming into something else entirely, a space where empathy and understanding were taking root. The flight attendant, still visibly rattled, stood awkwardly as Johnny's words echoed in his mind. The weight of the situation had not been lost on him. He had been caught in a moment of frustration, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone on that flight. Johnny, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, turned to address the rest of the passengers. "I know this may seem like a small moment, but I believe it's a reminder of something much bigger. We all have the power to make a difference in someone's life, no matter how small the gesture. It's the little things that count, the way we treat each other, the way we show kindness." The passengers, who had been watching the scene unfold, now seemed to feel a sense of unity. They exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others deep in thought. Johnny Depp had not only stood up for the elderly woman, but he had also given everyone in that cabin a lesson in humanity. The elderly woman, still sitting in her new seat, wiped away a tear as she listened to Johnny. She had never expected anything like this. She had never imagined that a simple flight would turn into such a profound moment. But now, she felt a sense of empowerment. She felt seen. She felt respected. And that in itself was a victory. The flight attendant, after a long pause, finally spoke. "You're right. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I've learned something today." His voice was sincere, And for the first time, he wasn't just apologizing because he had to. He was apologizing because he truly understood the impact of his actions. Johnny nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. It's okay. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them. We have the chance to make things right. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted completely. The passengers, who had been tense and uncertain, were now relaxed. Some even smiled at each other, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The flight attendant, now with a newfound sense of humility, began to assist the elderly woman with her seatbelt, making sure she was comfortable. Johnny took a moment to look around the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. He could see the change in their eyes, the understanding, the appreciation, the quiet recognition that something meaningful had just happened. It wasn't just a celebrity standing up for an elderly woman. It was a reminder that, no matter who we are, we all have the power to change the course of someone's day, someone's life. And that, Johnny knew, was the real lesson. As the plane continued its journey, the conversation shifted. Passengers began to talk to each other, some sharing their own stories of kindness and respect. The flight attendant, though still a little embarrassed, seemed to take his role more seriously now. He moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose, checking on passengers with genuine care. Johnny Depp had not only changed the course of the flight, but he had also ignited a spark in everyone aboard. The elderly woman, who had been the victim of mistreatment, now felt empowered. The flight attendant, who had been caught in a moment of frustration, now understood the power of kindness. And the passengers, who had witnessed it all, were reminded of the importance of treating each other with respect and dignity. Johnny had done more than just stand up for someone. He had reminded everyone that change begins with us. It begins with the choices we make, the actions we take, and the way we treat each other. And in that moment, Johnny Depp had shown them all what it meant to be truly human. As the plane continued its flight, the atmosphere remained changed. The events that had unfolded were far from ordinary, and the passengers could feel it. They had witnessed a moment of profound transformation, not just for the elderly woman, but for everyone aboard. Johnny Depp had sparked a shift in how they viewed one another, and in doing so, he had left an indelible mark on their hearts. The elderly woman, now sitting comfortably in her new seat, glanced out the window, her thoughts drifting. She had never imagined that a simple flight could turn into such an unforgettable experience. She had come on board expecting to face yet another day of being overlooked and underestimated. But now, she felt different. She felt seen. She felt valued. And most importantly, she felt like she mattered. Johnny Depp's words echoed in her mind. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are. She couldn't help but smile at the truth in those words. It wasn't about wealth, fame, or status. It was about treating each other with dignity and kindness. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person, no matter their age, appearance, or background. She glanced over at the flight attendant, who was now moving through the cabin with a new sense of purpose. His earlier apology had been genuine, and his actions since then had shown that he was committed to making things right. It was clear that he had learned something valuable that day, something that would stay with him long after the flight was over. Johnny Depp, who had been sitting quietly in his seat, looked around the cabin once more. He could feel the shift in the air, the sense of unity, the shared understanding that had blossomed among the passengers. It was as if a collective consciousness had been awakened, and everyone aboard had become more attuned to the importance of kindness and respect. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now preparing for our final approach. We'll be landing shortly. We hope you've had a pleasant flight, and we thank you for choosing to fly with us today. But for the passengers aboard this particular flight, the journey was far from ordinary. It had been a journey of transformation, of learning, of growth. And it was all thanks to one man's decision to stand up for what was right. Johnny Depp had shown them that sometimes the most powerful moments don't come from grand gestures or public displays. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from the small, everyday acts of kindness and respect that we offer to one another. It wasn't about being a celebrity. It wasn't about being famous. It was about being human, As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their belongings, there was a quiet sense of reflection in the air. Some exchanged smiles, others nodded in silent acknowledgement. It was clear that the events of the flight had left an impression on them all. They had learned something valuable, something that would stay with them long after they disembarked. Johnny Depp had not only changed the course of the flight, he had changed the hearts and minds of everyone aboard. And in doing so, he had reminded them all of the importance of treating each other with respect, dignity, and kindness. The elderly woman stood up from her seat, her legs a little shaky, but her heart full. She had been through so much in her life, but today, she had experienced something truly extraordinary. She had been treated with the respect she deserved, and she had witnessed a moment of change that would stay with her forever. She smiled to herself as she made her way to the exit. She had been a part of something bigger than herself, something that had touched the lives of everyone aboard that plane. And for that, she would be forever grateful. As the passengers disembarked, they carried with them the lessons of the flight. The lesson that respect and kindness are powerful forces, and that each of us has the ability to make a difference in someone's life. It wasn't about what we had or who we were. It was about how we treated each other. Johnny Depp had left an impact, not just as a famous actor, but as a human being who cared. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.